Fantastic. I think we should make a start while people are still coming in. Thank you, thank you, thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's great to see so many people coming in. That is wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Stevie Jade Hardy. I'm the Head of Change for Policing and Youth Justice here at the Youth Endowment Fund, and I have the pleasure of chairing today's session. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Youth Endowment Fund, but just a quick reminder, our mission is to find out what works in preventing children and young people from becoming involved in violence and build a movement to put this knowledge into practice. So when I came across Place Network Investigations, it was a while ago now, but I thought this was exactly the type of approach that we need to be showcasing as part of our virtual learning cafes to really spark debate and discussion. So I'm delighted. I always get excited for our virtual learning cafes, but I must say I've been really looking forward to this one in particular. So I'm going to be handing over in a moment to Robin and Tamara, but just to give a quick introduction to them both. So firstly, we have Dr. Robin Engel, who's a senior research scientist at the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University. We also have Dr. Tamara Herold, who is an associate professor of criminal justice at the University of Nevada. And before I hand over to them, just some very quick reminders. We are recording the session, so both the recording and the slides will be uploaded to our website within the next couple of days. So you're able to go over there and share it with people, rewatch it, and I'm sure you will want to rewatch it. We'll also be making sure that at the end of today's session, there will be time for questions and discussion. And so without any further delay, because I'm sure you'd much rather hear from them, I will hand over to Robin.
Well, thank you so much, Stevie. It is such a pleasure to be here. But I was just mentioning before we started that it would be even more lovely if we could be there in person, allowing us some much needed travel to an amazing place that you folks are all coming in from. The UK holds a near and dear place in my heart. I've been doing work in and out and around the area for well over a decade now, and I'm so thrilled to be here with you today. Also, many thanks to the Youth Endowment Fund for making this happen and for their really important work with the High Impact Unit and really being able to take these best practices from truly around the world and make them available to the practitioners in England and Wales and Scotland. I'm so thrilled to be a part of it. Also like to take just a quick moment to thank my colleagues focused in the UK at the University of Hull, the University College of London, Alberta University, where we have some great friends, William Graham, who's been working in this area for a long time, Oxford, and of course, we also have friends in the Netherlands that we've been working with, and I hope that they're on here today as well. And then finally, a great big thank you to the Home Office. The Home Office and the Ministry of Justice in particular have been really focused on driving evidence-based practices, and I'm just so excited to be able to tell you what's been going on in the U.S. But before I do that, I'm going to reintroduce my colleague, Tamara Herold. Let's just be honest, she's brilliant. I'm the show pony. I'm the one that kicks us off and will end us. But in the middle of this presentation is going to be all the stuff that you are here to really focus on. She is a brilliant colleague and has been working and thinking about violence reduction in our communities in the United States and now around the world for a very long time. Not to date you, Tamara, of course. But Tamara, would you like to say a quick hello and tell folks a little bit about yourself?
Sure, absolutely. So first of all, good afternoon, everyone. It is, like Robin said, such a pleasure to be with you here today. And I do apologize, my voice, this is not my normal voice. Robin will tell you, I was a musician in a past life. I really did that before going into academia, and I always wanted a really sultry, kind of raspy voice. This is not what I was going for. I just currently have a bit of a cold, and I was just too excited to be here. I know so many people plan to be here today, so I'm going to muddle through with this voice. But my background is in an area known as crime science, and so I study environments, and I study how crime concentrates. within different places and why that occurs. And so, like Robin said, I've been thinking about violence reduction for a long time. And Robin and I have joined forces, and we've really been exploring, testing these ideas that we have around how we can address some of our persistent crime hotspots. And so we're going to bring that to you here today. I'm also currently with the National Institute of Justice, where my main mandate is bringing evidence to action. So we're taking all of this research, all of our knowledge, and bringing it to frontline personnel who can put it into practice. So that's a little bit about me. Robin, I'll put this back to you.
Great, thank you. So yeah, Tamara and I are a little bit unusual in that we are trained as academics, but we spend more time in police cars and working in our most disadvantaged communities. We spend more time there than we do in our office, that's for sure. And I also have personally been doing this a very long time, working on violence reduction strategies. And in fact, I'm going to take you down a little bit of history, how we got to where we are and how the folks in the UK and your work has impacted us along the way, and how we have been able to have impact there as well. So as I mentioned, I've been doing this a long time, but most of my work was focused in Cincinnati. Cincinnati, Ohio, for those of you who don't know, is it's one of those sort of small to mid-sized cities where we have violence problems, just like all the other U.S. Cities deal with it, but they deal with mostly gun violence, which is a little bit different than what you have predominantly in the U.K. But nonetheless, violence is violence, and thinking about how it congregates among offenders and in particular places, what we can do about that, we've been able to really have great impact in Cincinnati. Now, I know what you're all thinking. You know that famous Mark Twain quote, and if you don't, I will tell it to you again. When the world comes to an end, I want to be in Cincinnati because they're always 20 years behind. Well, I hope that is no longer the case. We have been leading the way on some violence reduction efforts, that are evidence-based, and we will be talking a little bit about that now. So Tamara, if you'll move me to the next slide. Tamara's going to drive, so every now and then I'll send a prompt to remind her. But I wanted to just set our talk in context and think about the evolution of focus deterrence. Now, a lot of you know that concept of focus deterrence. I understand there are multi-site trials through your VRUs, your violence reduction units, that are implementing focus deterrence across the UK right now. And so just to set in context, we're going to be talking and focusing mostly on place network investigations, which is a relatively new strategy, but I wanted to put it in context. So if you think about the evolution of focus deterrence, it really started with ceasefire. Ceasefire was in the 1990s. It started in Boston with some academic colleagues working directly in the field with practitioners and better understanding how they could reduce. In this case, in Boston, it was for juvenile offenders, and what levers you could pull, right? Pulling levers is another concept you'll hear about. What levers you could pull to focus deterrence on particular individuals and get them to reduce their likelihood of being engaged in our case, gun violence specifically. That evolution of ceasefire also had another component to it, which was community-based, working with former violence-involved individuals, former gang members, the OGs, the original gangsters that have come along and wanted to change their neighborhoods and give back to their communities. So there were two pieces to ceasefire. And what ended up ultimately happening was kind of split apart in the US, and the strategies that really focused on the outreach workers, they're called street workers or outreach workers, those folks really took on that title of ceasefire, while we had a migration of researchers and practitioners that were focused more directly on the police-led initiatives. That turned into what we call that focus deterrence intervention, which is what many of you have been modeling in the UK. But we always focused here in the U.S. on group violence. So GVI, or group violence intervention, was really how we started to define it and think about it more clearly, versus what I believe that's happening in the UK right now is a focus on the individual more so than the group or the gang. I don't know that that's necessarily true for all of your interventions, but certainly some of them have really been focusing very heavily on the social service angle, working with younger and younger offenders, and thinking about how you can get your community voice and your social services in place, and less about having that group focus on consequences in terms of intervention. So this is how we sort of evolved. And I'm going to now let you know sort of how the focused deterrence piece has also evolved into place network investigations. But first, thinking about that group focused deterrence. And this is how what we did in the US is a little bit different than what's happening in the UK. Our focused deterrence principles, really kind of 5 core principles. First, active chronic offenders commit a majority of violence. We know this to be true. This is the 80-20 principle on steroids, thinking about 20% of your individuals that are impacting 80% of your violence approximately. In many of our American cities, the numbers are much greater. In contrast, a very small group of offenders located in micro hotspots are driving the majority of our gun violence in American cities. These offenders that engage in this, we believe, are loosely organized in groups and gangs, the very traditional, structured, hierarchical, color-wearing gangs that you heard about and learned about, mostly through the media and through movies and things like that. That doesn't really exist nearly as much in the U.S. and has been fading over the last couple of decades. Rather, our offenders are just loosely organized in groups and gangs and affiliations with peers. Most of the violence in our cities is based on disrespect. And I suspect that this is true in the UK as well. It's the norms and narratives of the street. Our violence is mostly male-based, right? If you think about the percentage of individuals that are involved in very serious chronic violence, a vast majority of them are male. And it's about the norms and narratives of the street, what it means to be a man, and protecting your reputation at all costs. And so much of this violence is based on just perceptions of disrespect. You danced with my girl, you stepped on my foot, you touched my car, and those types of minor interactions can result in an explosion of violence. But we believe that this violence can be impacted through group pressure and group support. So that group pressure, meaning that law enforcement is going to target particular groups and gangs, and through that very focused deterrence approach, using those resources that are available to focus on the groups and gangs that are committing the violence, but also getting our social service providers to also focus their efforts and their resources on that same group to give them a way out if they so choose. And then finally, to make all of this happen, you have to have a sustained communication with the streets. Individual offenders need to know that something different is happening. And if they don't realize that something different is happening, then they're not going to change their action. But how we have this sustained communication with the street through the group violence intervention work that's being done now, we have more than just your typical call-in sessions, which I know many of you are familiar with. But they think about what we call home visits and other techniques to be able to continually get that message to the street. That's what focused deterrence looks like in the United States. And to be quite honest, we had a great run with focused deterrence, and I was involved in several of those strategies. And that's how I first got familiar with what was happening in the UK. So Tamara, if you'll move me to the next slide here. The Cincinnati Initiative to Reduce Violence, we called it SERVE. And SERVE had a great run. We were able to use that focused deterrence approach, focusing our law enforcement, our social services, and our community collectively, working with executives from Procter & Gamble that are headquartered in Cincinnati to develop a structure, an organizational structure for our efforts to be able to sustain these reductions over time. And we had a great run. Our initial evaluation for the first 3 years showed a 41% reduction in what we call GMI homicides, or gang or group member involved homicides, and a 22% reduction in all shootings. And we were able to sustain this over that 3-year period and then the next year or two beyond. And this effort actually took me around the world. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know what was happening in Cincinnati. Instead of being the place where we were 20 years behind, we were 20 years ahead. Folks from the Home Office, from the London Metropolitan Police came to visit. We had individuals and practitioners come all the way from Australia just to see what was happening in Cincinnati. And it was so gracious. The Home Office actually brought me over. I got to have meetings at 10 Downing Street, which was quite a thrill for an American, I have to say, politics aside. And we were thinking, we've got it. We've figured it out. But then, Tamara, if you'll forward, what happened in Cincinnati? We were not able to sustain it after all. We built it for sustainability, but there are inherent limitations of any focus deterrent strategy, and we ran smack into them. We had leadership changes at both the police department and at the city level, and we realized that the work we were doing was not ingrained into the culture of this is how we reduce violence. We simply could not overcome the politics to sustain it, and we ended up sort of fading away. But also the limitations of focus deterrent strategies. And we'll talk about that here and why we think PNI is such a great alternative, and maybe not even an alternative, but an add-on opportunity to bolster what's happening with the focus deterrent strategies. Tamara, if you'll take me to the next slide. What I'd like to do is set up for you a thought piece that we engaged in. So both Dr. Herold and I, we were asked to come out to meet with the sheriff of Las Vegas Metro Police Department. And in Las Vegas, they had a lot of things going on. This was back in 2017, 2018, somewhere in there. And we met with then Sheriff Lombardo. And we said, Sheriff, I have a research center. We have some funds. We'd like to test some strategies. What is your biggest problem in Las Vegas? And he said, gun violence. And I said, okay, there are 3 primary strategies that people are using in the US right now to deal with this. One is hotspots policing. A second, focus deterrence, which we'll get to in a moment. And then finally, we have the place network investigations, which at the time was new, novel approach. And Sheriff Lombardo said, okay, I'll take all of it. And I was like, no. We need to test these things. We're scientists. We do them individually. And he said, no, they all sound great. We'll do all of it. And that's when Tamara and I realized that these strategies could be layered and sequenced. They each have effective components, but if you put them together, you could really have this very robust impact that's sustained over time on violence. So I want to go through each of those components real quick before I turn this over to Tamara. The first is that hotspot policing concept. So for those of you who may not be familiar, this is just where we use law enforcement resources and we flood particular areas with high visibility patrols. In some cases, those officers get out and walk. Sometimes they are stationary. Sometimes they have lights on. Sometimes they have lights off. There's a whole bunch of different variations of of hotspot policing rather. Hotspot policing has been evaluated extensively using randomized controlled trial designs. Anthony Braga, who is a brilliant researcher here in the US, has done a series of meta-analyses, and work with him and his colleagues have demonstrated over and over again that hotspot policing has a very robust but often short-term reduction in violence. What it does, if you think about the crime triangle, and for those of you who may not be familiar, in order to have a crime, you have to have 3 things that come together in time and space. You have to have a victim, you have to have an offender, and you have to have a place. And when those 3 things congregate in time, then you have an opportunity for a crime, and in this case, violence. If you remove any one side of the triangle, we know that you can reduce the likelihood of violence or crime happening. And further, if you take out more than one piece of that triangle, you have a greater likelihood of sustained reduction. So thinking about hotspot policing, you can see on this brilliant graph that my colleague Tamara created for me, The crime impact, where we're focused with hotspot policing, is on the place. And when you're thinking about that intervention focus, we have evolved over time. It used to be a community, an entire neighborhood. We're just going to flood the neighborhood with police. We realized pretty quickly that you can do more damage in communities than you can be helpful when you flood neighborhoods. You feel like it's an occupying army. There's a lot of concern about the legitimacy of police in doing that.
Well done.
Sorry, I'll just ask you to please mute. Thank you so much. So those places, thinking about that intervention focus, the jurisdictional segment, we've gotten it narrowed down literally to a street segment, so a block, and in some cases even smaller than that, but in a particularly problem place, for example. And we also know a lot about how this intervention works, how often and how long you have to be there. The science is very robust, demonstrating that if you randomly assign uniformed officers to these jurisdiction segments, and you do it randomly every 2 hours, and you have them spend anywhere from 12 to 15 minutes, that's the maximum likelihood to reduce violence. Anything more than 15 or 16 minutes in a 2-hour random segment, you're wasting resources. Anything below that, you're not getting your maximum effect. So the science on this is very strong. The complexity for this, for law enforcement organizations to do this, is very low. Actually, you can do this tomorrow if you're a police executive that's watching and you decide we want to stabilize our violence, our communities, and literally stop the bleeding. This is one of the easiest and most effective ways to do it, because it only takes you, the law enforcement agency, to be able to put this in place. So you have few or no partnerships that are needed, and it's not a particularly complex strategy. That means you have that rapid onset, but your duration is short term, because you cannot sustain this level of focus and resources continually in many of these neighborhoods, or in this case, the jurisdictional segment that you're focused on. So that takes us to focus deterrence. And as we were explaining to Sheriff Lombardo at the time, group violence intervention, GVIs, these are, again, as I just described before, the work that we had done in Cincinnati and lots of other places. There were so many American cities. And again, meta-analysis done by Anthony Braga and his colleagues have demonstrated the complete and absolute impact that you can have. It's really quite amazing, the impact that GVI work, or that focused deterrence intervention strategies, can have. Here you're focused on the offender in particular, but we all know that offenders are tomorrow's victims and vice versa, right? So that nexus between offender and victim is always ever changing, and the focus on offender ultimately takes you to a focus on victims. Here, the intervention focuses on social networks, particularly for that group violence intervention. So you're looking and understanding how people are networked together, and how you can use those networks, or that peer pressure, to have influence to get people to change their behaviors. The intervention focus here is about, we describe it as medium. So you thinking about the complexity of the strategy. It's in the medium range, right? It takes a while to get these strategies planned and up and running. You're talking about sometimes a 3, 4, even up to a 6-month planning period before the GVI interventions can really be launched. And it takes several partners. You need social services at the table. You need other law enforcement partners, right? You need your prosecutors, and in many cases, the judges on board, lots of different law enforcement focus there, but you also need your community. And we talk about the moral voice of the community, having your community partners on board as well. So there are several partners that are involved in the group violence intervention work. We know that the onset of this type of strategy is a little bit lagged, because it takes us some time to get going. But then once we have it up and running, the duration and what you can likely expect from violence reductions using focused deterrence or group violence intervention is in the intermediate range. It often lasts a year or two. Very few of these strategies last beyond 3 years in terms of their impact unless there's significant change or updates to the model. Which finally leads us to PNI, Place Network Investigations. And my colleague is going to talk you through all of the details of this. So let me just take a moment and tell you why we're so excited about it. Because we believe that the impact, when you think about that crime triangle and how we can reduce violence in our communities, Place Network Investigations focuses on offender, victim, and place, all three components of that crime triangle simultaneously. The infrastructure that we're looking to focus on, that intervention focuses on the crime infrastructure and thinking through what is it that underlies a neighborhood where you see chronic violence again and again, not just by the same individuals, because you can focus on them, on those individuals, but we know that then another group or gang just replaces those individuals in the same places. What is it about the place that is different, that makes crime appear there and not somewhere else? And that's where we're going to learn from Dr. Herold all about this. The complexity of these strategies, this is high complexity because you need to get a lot of your other government focus. It's a holistic governance approach. So it's not just about law enforcement. In fact, we often say that police cannot do this alone. Law enforcement cannot do this alone. They obviously need those social services partners and the community partners that are involved in the group violence intervention, but they need even more than that. And that's where a holistic governance approach really takes this to the next level. So those partnerships, then there's many partners that are at the table, which takes a lot of coordination. So it's a deferred onset. It takes quite a bit of time to set this up and get it right. But once you do, you can have sustained long-term impact. And we're testing this right now in a number of cities, and we'll show you at the end of Tamara's presentation what those results look like. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Herold. We're going to hope your voice keeps up and you're ready to roll and talk about Place Network Investigations.
Thank you so much, Robin. And yes, ready to roll. So just to give you a little bit of background about how this came about, as I mentioned, my background's in crime science. So I spent my doctoral program learning why crime concentrates in some places and not others. And Robin and I were always struck by the fact that, yes, crime concentrates in particular types of places, but the more interesting thing is that crime tends to return to the same places over and over and over again. And that's a fascinating concept or a fascinating dynamic, because we can understand the dynamics of crime and why it might focus in a particular place or concentrate in a particular place. But once we've deployed our resources to those locations, the question becomes, why does it pop back up in the exact same location? So we know that crime is sticky. It concentrates across both people and places. And so the question becomes, why? Why do we find that hotspots tend to be generational? So in a lot of American jurisdictions, if there are police officers and we ride with them and we say, take us to the worst spot in your jurisdiction, they can take us there. They'll say, this is the most violent location in our jurisdiction. I'll say, how long has it been that way? And they'll say, my entire career. Well, that's fascinating, because if what is predictable is preventable, sort of military science, right? Why is it that crime tends to persist in these same locations generation after generation? And as everybody knows, we kind of get this J curve if we look at crime across any jurisdiction. Most places have little to no crime, but there's a small proportion of places that account for the vast majority of crime in any given jurisdiction. So thinking back to where Robin was implementing that focused deterrent strategy, we looked at shooting victimizations, and we actually found that there were these 23 persistent violent microlocations, tiny areas, think 2 to 3 blocks in radius, where gun violence tended to concentrate year after year, decade after decade. And although those tiny microlocations made up only about 1.4% of the city's landmass, they accounted for more than 42% of all shooting victims. And again, these were persistent, violent hotspots. And so to think about that when it comes to gun violence, but all violence in particular, in any crime type that you're really looking at, you'll have these small micro locations that account for a substantial proportion of individuals who are victimized in any given jurisdiction. And so this was a fascinating dynamic. And we're thinking, well, what should we do about this? And also that year in Cincinnati, unfortunately, we had an officer who was shot and killed. And we started thinking a little bit differently. We also started thinking about the idea that officer safety and wellness is significantly impacted by the fact that we have these persistent violent micro-locations where police are called in constantly to respond in these locations. So they're constantly being asked to respond, insert themselves into situations that are high risk, where they can make career-ending decisions. And we found that actually officer injuries and those high-risk encounters were also disproportionately concentrated in these same micro-locations. So from our perspective, from an officer safety and wellness perspective, we had huge incentive to think about what could we possibly do to eliminate the dynamics that have allowed the violence to persist in these locations over time. And what's fascinating, just as Robin mentioned, we used to think about neighborhoods as being bad. And then we realized, well, it's not really neighborhoods. It's sort of smaller areas, maybe 2 to 3 block radiuses, or maybe even just a particular street segment. What's fascinating is even along a particular street segment, you'll find that crime concentrates in some locations and then never at other particular addresses that are on that same street location. Or maybe sometimes you get a call for service someplace and then it goes dormant. So it's sort of cyclical. You'll find some places light up and then they become dormant over time. So why is that? Well, if you ride with any officer or if you talk with any community member, they can kind of point out those interesting places. And they'll say, this place is kind of involved in criminal activity over here, and this place is involved. We find that offenders will use this place over here. But what's interesting from my perspective and from Dr. Engel's perspective is that we've never really had a strategy or a mechanism to take all of that street level intelligence, collect that, interpret it in a meaningful way, and then translate that into action where we can do something about those places that matter. So there's been recent advances in crime in place theory. So when we look at a hotspot map and you see all the little red dots that pop up everywhere, what those really represent are our crime sites. So those are places where crime regularly occurs. And we know where our hotspot locations are. In fact, Dr. Engel and I, we can give people a blank map of their jurisdiction and say, fill in your hotspots, and then compare it to a real-time hotspot map. And people will nail it every single time. People know where these persistent violent hotspots are. What's interesting, though, is there's at least 3 other places that offenders use as part of their daily illicit activities. One is a convergent setting, and that is a public location where offenders might congregate. So people engaged in crime, they might be using a particular street corner, or there's an alleyway, or there might be a park where people tend to congregate. And this is important. The third type of space, we've got the crime site, the convergent setting. They're also comfort spaces. They're like convergent settings. They're places where people congregate, but they're privately controlled by the offenders. These comfort spaces are places where if I'm moving a product, whether it's drugs, guns, weapons, or even humans in the case of human trafficking, these are privately controlled locations that offenders use as part of their day-to-day illicit activities. And the final location that we find tends to matter in terms of crime dynamics is something called a corrupting spot. So when I was a young doctoral student, I looked at all of the hottest hotspots in the city of Cincinnati. And what was fascinating to me, something that stood out right away, was that every single one of them had a mom and pop convenience store right in the center of these hotspots. I thought that's so interesting. And as I learned more about the dynamics of crime in those locations, I could see that those particular businesses were contributing or facilitating the crime problem in interesting ways. They might have been selling drug paraphernalia or allowing individuals engaged in crime to sort of loiter in front of these locations, or if police rolled up, they'd allow them to run inside and sort of hide their drugs or their weapons inside the store someplace. We also find that these corrupting spots might be involved in buying and selling stolen products. That helps to facilitate the market. They could be laundering money. When I think about copper theft, which is huge in the United States, I'm sure the UK has experienced this as well. But I look at a hotspot map for copper theft in any given jurisdiction, and it just lights up like a Christmas tree. It looks like copper theft is everywhere, all over the city. And to try and protect copper throughout an entire jurisdiction would be an impossible task. But when you think about what's driving that copper theft, it's usually one or two metal recycling plants that don't ask questions. We'll take copper from wherever it's stolen, catalytic converters, street lights. It doesn't matter where it came from. They'll take that copper and they'll pay for it. That's an example of a corrupting spot, a place that will help to drive crime throughout a jurisdiction or in and around a particular location. So when you start to put these things together and you don't just think about the crime site, you realize that there is a larger infrastructure that is allowing crime to persist in this location. And so when we were looking at a very early crime hotspot, there was a particular apartment building that had historically been problematic. And the particular police commander who was in charge of this district, this was the #1 calls for service location in the entire jurisdiction. And that police commander did everything that science told her to do. It said, focus your police resources there. So she used a directed patrol hotspot initiative to try to stabilize the violence, and it worked. But just as Dr. Engel pointed out, as soon as you redeploy your resources elsewhere, crime would pop right back up. So she said, okay, I'm going to use a place-based problem-solving strategy. And she held the apartment managers accountable for going in there and improving the environmental conditions at the apartment. So using SEPTED style strategies, crime prevention through environmental design. So improving the lighting, putting up gating, controlling access, strengthening their leasing policies. They did all of those things. And again, violence decreased just a little bit. And so it was looking really good. She then deployed a focused deterrence, group violence intervention strategy, and quickly dismantled one of the most violent, very young, very violent gangs in the neighborhood. And sure enough, crime plummeted. And it was fantastic. And she looked great in front of all the command staff. She would show up and she would show her numbers, and they would look like crime had just disappeared. And it lasted for a few months. Life was good for this commander for a few months, but slowly but surely, crime returned back to that same location. And in fact, within 9 months or so, had exceeded previous levels of violence. And so the question became, why? We did everything that science told us we should do in order to control crime in this location, and it worked, but it was temporary. And when we started thinking about the idea that it's not just this apartment building that's attractive to those engaged in crime, it's these other places that are used as part of the logistics associated with the violence and the crime in that area. And we started uncovering those convergent settings. So for an example, a park that the people engaged in crime would use to sort of monitor the open air drug market that was near that apartment building, or a corner store where people would congregate, or specific residences that were being used as comfort spaces in and around that location, or some businesses, nearby businesses that were part of a strip mall that were engaged in facilitating the violence, either by laundering money or buying and selling stolen goods. Once we saw that entire place network infrastructure, we realized what was happening was one of two things. Offenders would simply retreat into the rest of that infrastructure until we decide to redeploy our resources elsewhere. We turn our attention to the next hotspot, and then they reestablish themselves right back in that same location. So you find that persistent violent hotspot, or we find a temporary displacement effect. They still have that entire infrastructure in place, so they simply move around the corner maybe. And maybe they're not committing as much violence, but you see some evidence of displacement. Unless we're able to eliminate this entire infrastructure, we should either one, expect at least some level of displacement, or two, find that crime will eventually return to these exact same locations. And so we started turning our attention to this infrastructure. We said, what if we could eliminate this entire crime infrastructure? What could we do with that? But as Dr. Engel pointed out, it doesn't make sense for police to be the one really focused on trying to eliminate the entire infrastructure. The police, working with the community, can identify what that place network looks like. But now, how do we dismantle it? And that's where we get into the holistic governance response. So we've established in the jurisdictions that we'll talk about in just a moment, these all city teams, and they're not run by the police department. This comes from city level leadership, jurisdiction level leadership, whether it's city or county, and they are the individuals that are holding everybody accountable for bringing their resources and coming to the table to help engage in a coordinated response. So we bring everybody, all city resources to the table. And what's absolutely fascinating is if you take one of their calls for service map, let's just consider fire, or let's think about buildings and inspections, any of your local social services, and you take their hotspot maps or where they're engaged in services, and you overlay that on top of a police hotspot map for crime, you find that quality of life issues tend to concentrate in the exact same locations that the violence is concentrating. And so what this allows us to do is break down the silos between these different city departments, coordinate all of our intelligence, and then pool all of our resources together to start changing the dynamics in these persistent micro hotspot locations in a way that make it very difficult for those engaged in crime to use these spaces to engage in criminal activity. So what it looks like, the roles and stages basically goes like something like this. We start with the investigations. It's the critical piece. It's the critical component, because we don't want to flood a neighborhood necessarily with police officers. We also don't want to just flood it with resources with sort of a shotgun approach, trying to pour resources. We want to be as strategic as possible in terms of our very limited resources that we have in our jurisdictions. We want to be very strategic with our application. So we start with the investigations, police working with the community, identify those place networks. They take that intelligence back to that all city team and they say, here are the places that matter. And here's how and why they matter. Here is how this particular place is being used as part of the crime place network. And here within this all city team, we engage in very high level strategic problem solving. How do we shut down the opportunities for people who are engaged in criminal activity to use these places in this way? And then long term, and this is the exciting part for Dr. Engel and I, long term, really for the health and well-being of the community, we start thinking about how do we engage the community in a way where we make it just not only unacceptable to commit crime in these places, but also very difficult, because we are going to rip that infrastructure out from underneath these individuals engaged in crime, and we're going to return it back to the community. And what's fascinating, when you bring an all city team together, you have all sorts of levers that you can pull, all sorts of resources that you can bring to the table to start changing the dynamics in a particular place. I remember there was a dumpster sitting in a parking lot where a lot of violence would break out. What they realized were people were playing dice games behind this dumpster. And it was fascinating because bringing that small piece of intelligence to the all city team, fire stepped up and said, wait a minute, we can require them to secure this dumpster in a different place so it doesn't provide that cover for people to be engaged in this type of crime. And as soon as they did that, the violent activity was eliminated, because that opportunistic that Dr. Engel talked about, that opportunistic event where somebody disrespected somebody lost a game and wasn't happy about it, we've eliminated the opportunity to do that in a public space. We had another particular location where there were lots of drive-by shootings, and it was fascinating because there were these cars parked along this particular street segment, and the heroes in that particular scenario tended to be traffic and engineering. They looked at that street and they said, this is fascinating. The people engaged in crime, they're the ones who are parking their cars there, and they're using them sort of as barricades. In case somebody comes by and tries to do a drive-by shooting, they're using their cars as barricades. They're also storing their drugs, guns, weapons inside of these vehicles What if we changed the flow of traffic on the street and removed that parking from that footprint? They went door to door to each of the community members, and the community said, please take away this parking. We do not use it. People who are engaged in violence are parking in this location. So again, not the police that are solving the problem, it's traffic and engineering, but they're the ones bringing all that intelligence about how offenders are using that space. And then we're leveraging all of our resources, and we can go down the list here. Every jurisdiction's a little bit different. Every all city team is a little bit different. It depends on the resources that are there, depends on who can come to the table, who can be most effective. But by bringing everyone together and focusing on that coordinated response, we come up with really creative solutions that are pretty incredible. And it's not just about blocking opportunities. I have a friend who does a lot of community resiliency work, and she told me very, very early on, she said, Tamara, it's not enough. You can't take a negative space, a space that once had crime, and make it neutral. You need just take away the crime. That is not enough. You need to think about how you activate that space. So now the community is engaged in using that space for legitimate activities. And once you do that, you will create the dynamics for long-term sustainable change in that location, because now the community has reactivated that space. They're taking back over that location, and it's going to be very hard for those engaged in crime to come back and re-control that location. And of course, it makes perfect sense. It seems like common sense now. But at the time, we were just so interested in removing the criminal element. We weren't thinking long-term, how do we sustain that particular dynamic? And so what we're focused on when we're removing place networks is not just ripping out the network, but then reinvigorating the community by bringing them resources, creating safe anchors, creating safe spaces and things that community need, thinking about what the community needs, and then fulfilling those community needs by bringing those resources, reactivating those spaces in those ways. And so we wanted to try this out. We did this first in Cincinnati, Ohio, where Dr. Engel was working. And so we said, okay, this sounds great in theory. Can we do this in practice? Will it actually work? And so we put together this all-city team. We had 2 initial pilot locations. We started in East Westwood and then sort of moved along to Westwood to see what we can do. It's so interesting. Cincinnati is made up of, I think it's 52. Dr. Engel could correct me if I'm wrong, but it's 52 different neighborhoods. And each of them sort of have their own identity, their own demographic makeup. And so it was a perfect way to see, would a strategy like this work among different populations and in different locations? So we picked East Westwood and Westwood, 2 of those violent, persistent hotspots that were accounting for that disproportionate number of shootings and gun violence. And we said, okay, what will we find? We sent investigators in. They partnered with the community. And sure enough, in these 2 locations, they started to uncover, beyond the crime sites, beyond the sites you see that are in red, where we knew crime was happening, they started finding other components, other aspects of that crime place network. They took that intelligence back to the board and systematically thought about, how do we remove the opportunities for those engaged in crime to use these spaces? And you see it's called Pivot at the bottom there. Place network investigations is much easier to remember than place-based investigations of violent offender territories. It is the exact same strategy. They just tend to call it Pivot in Cincinnati. Throughout the rest of the United States now, we call it PNI. So they uncover this crime place network, they bring it back to the board, they systematically start removing those locations, and what happens? Well, I can tell you, in the first site, they had about an 80 to 90% reduction in gun violence. In the second site, they had about a 70% reduction in gun violence. Now, I don't think anybody would be sad with a 70% reduction in any type of crime, but I'm a nerd and I'm a researcher, and I wanted to know, why is that first site outperforming that second site? What happened here? What's the difference? And in speaking with the investigators, sort of post intervention, it was fascinating, because in that second location, they said, you know what, Doc? We missed a location that was part of that crime place network in our initial investigation. We've since uncovered it. We've since taken it to the board. We've since removed that from the crime infrastructure. And now, 6 years later, that site is outperforming the first site. And so just to sort of show you, this was site 1. where we had our 80-90% reduction in gun-related violence. And so you can see the 2 green bars were sort of the intervention period where we were implementing P&I, and you can kind of see how it completely changed the dynamics of that neighborhood over time. As Dr. Engel sort of suggested early on, this particular strategy is not a panacea for crime. It's not going to solve all your problems. We really should be thinking about how we layer this with other crime prevention strategies, but you can see how focusing in not just on the place temporarily with hotspots, not just with the offender victim networks and maybe making arrests and using a targeted deterrence approach, but by focusing on the place, you can change place dynamics long term. And here was site number 2, where they haven't had a single incident in many, many years now of violence because they've completely changed the dynamics of the location. And in terms of long-term outcomes for me, I like to think about, the human impact of this type of work, because we overlook it. We think about statistics. They say the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic. And I like to keep that in mind because for me, there are so many lives that are impacted by this type of work. For me, when I think about the number of individuals who are impacted, this is just in that original site in East Westwood, you're saving how many lives by changing the dynamics associated with that place? How many other violent victimizations were avoided by removing that criminogenic infrastructure? And really interesting from my perspective is how many people were diverted away from the traditional criminal justice system. We had made so many arrests in these locations trying to control that violence that now this is not necessary, right? We are starting to divert people. We are addressing crime using alternative interventions that don't require the same number of resources and other things. I read a really cool quote earlier yesterday. It said, statistics are just human beings with the tears dried off, right? So I think about each of these little stick figures and all of the people that they know and are associated with them, all of the lives that were impacted by the work, the great work that the police department did in conjunction with the city. And it really gives me hope that we can do a little bit better in terms of thinking about crime problems, not just gun violence, but all violence in general, and also property-related crimes. How can we change place dynamics by thinking about place networks in a way that make it difficult for offenders to continue with the logistics of their particular types of crime? Now, Robin is brilliant. So she said to me, Tamara, what would you like to do for the next few years? I said, I'd like to see if we can replicate these results in other cities. What would we find? And so I'm going to turn it back over to her. She's going to talk more about the work that we've been engaged in more recently with some sites across the United States. Robin.
Great. Thank you, Tamara. And I think you can all sense Tamara's passion. It's hard to, when you work with Tamara, there is no way you cannot feel passionate about this as well, because she cares not just about the science, but about the people and about the officers. As we mentioned, those officers that are going to those repeat problematic places and putting themselves in the line of danger as well. So we, when she said, she wanted to do this, thought we were onto something here, and could we take it to the next level? So with generous funding from the Arnold Ventures, it's a philanthropic organization in the United States that funds research related to education, but also criminal justice. They have a criminal justice component, and in this case, policing interventions. But Arnold Ventures typically, they're focused on research, and they don't do a lot of work on implementation. But somehow we were fortunate enough to convince those funders that we needed funding for an implementation to get it right. These cities that agreed would need technical assistance and training to be able to introduce this new intervention, and then we'd be able to evaluate it on the backside. So they funded us to work in 6 different sites. Now, just like anything else, we have success stories, but we also have, we've learned a lot of lessons. So you see this map here. And as we got going, there were 2 locations that actually never could really get it off the ground through implementation. And it's not through lack of effort by the organizations that were involved. And by Tamara and I, we spent a lot of time going across the country here, trying to get these things kicked off. But in Harris County, Texas, which surrounds Houston, Harris County Sheriff's folks really struggled with getting this implementing PNI, in part because they were already doing a lot of other things. And doing those things well in some cases could have been better in others, but nonetheless, they were doing a lot of things and kind of spread thin. And remember that PNI takes a lot of that initial effort. It takes time. It's a deferred approach. And so you need to do PNI and implement it as you're implementing other things, and you need the capacity to be able to do that. So Harris County, Texas, we were unable to actually implement. The same was true in Philadelphia. Philadelphia had a lot of stop-starts. They had some leadership changes. They had changes in the police organization at the lower levels as well. Tamara, how many times did you go in train in Philadelphia, train those investigators?
So many times, so many times.
So lots of different people involved, but we weren't really able to get it going. So what I'm going to focus you on now is the sites where we did have success with the actual implementation. And then once it's implemented, hey, is it actually working? And that was the part of our evaluation team. We work with Dr. Nicholas Corsaro. He's one of our colleagues at the University of Cincinnati, a brilliant statistician. He was not involved in the implementation. Rather, we have him sort of held to the side so that we can make sure that we have fidelity to the model, that Tamara and I are doing that, but then he runs the statistical analyses at the end to see what type of impact we had. And I'm going to share with you some initial results. And so Tamara, if you'll take me to the next one, let's talk about Las Vegas first. Las Vegas was one of those pilot site places, as I mentioned, when we went in and talked to the sheriff, wanted to do all 3 things. So we did a randomized control trial of their hotspots. We did a randomized control trial of part of a focus intervention, focus deterrence. They did a call-in session, and so we measured the impact of that. But they also did one location that was a PNI pilot test. They had great success in that pilot test. And so then when we had additional resources, they decided to expand it to 5 additional PNI sites. And here you see some of our initial results. What I'm showing to you here are the pre-post PNI implementation. This is interrupted time series models for all you statistical geeks out there that really like to know all of the details. We do also have difference in difference models and things like that are right now we're putting together for peer review, and we're happy to share and send those as they become available, but we'll be putting them out for peer review here in the next month or so. But what this shows, during this time period, so pre and post, Las Vegas was one of those interesting cities that didn't have an increase in violence after 2020. Most of our cities in the US 2020 and thereafter with the pandemic had a very sharp and dramatic increase in violence. It's now, of course, tapered down, lots of different work and reasons for that, but Las Vegas didn't experience that. They actually had violent crime that decreased citywide, and that's that first light green bar that you see. So taking a look at this pre-post implementation period, we had a city where citywide violence was going down. But the question is, did the PNI sites themselves outperform the rest of the city? And in fact, what we found was 4 out of the 5 sites actually outperformed citywide, and by a great margin here when you're taking a look at the reduction in violent crime, 37% reduction. And by the way, these are area commands, so that's what they stand for, the term there. These are all different area commands where the PNI site was located. Only one site still had reductions, which I'll take any day, but didn't outperform the city. Of course, we can't measure what would have happened without a P&I intervention there, but we do see that it's remarkable what was happening in these other locations. Tamara, do you want to speak about any of these locations specifically? This is Tamara's hometown, if you will. She's with the University of Nevada, Las Vegas.
Yes. Well, I just wanted to point out that the CCAC is the Convention Center Area Command. And for those of you who have visited my beautiful city, you'll know that is where the Las Vegas Strip is located. So different dynamics potentially in a tourist corridor. And that might account for why we didn't see the same significant reductions that you might find in more of a neighborhood-based hotspot.
Exactly. Thank you, Tamara. So then thinking about, again, what does this look like compared to the rest of the city? But also, people were concerned, and we were as well, are we just displacing crime? Are we just moving it around the corner temporarily? And so we also looked at the contiguous areas around the P&I site. And what we found when we looked at the percent of fewer violent crimes, taking all of the P&I sites, in this case, the 5 P&I sites in Las Vegas Metro, combined collectively 31% fewer violent crimes in those combined P&I sites. We also, though, saw a 10% reduction, fewer violent crimes in the contiguous sites around the P&I sites themselves. And then when you put those two together, the areas around and the site itself, we found about a 17% fewer violent crimes were being committed in the sites and in the areas surrounding. These are all statistically significant declines, and they're relative to the changes in the remainder of the city. So we had really great impact here in Las Vegas Metro, and so proud of the effort and the work by those teams. Moving on to Denver, Colorado. Denver, they were really interesting in that they have now expanded their effort even further after their initial results. Denver is now home to Dr. Herold. Where do you actually live? We're not quite sure. You just travel
everywhere.
the country.
I'm everywhere.
You're everywhere.
Yes.
And so she is working directly with the Denver Police Department and continues to do so. But these are the initial evaluations when we first got started. So again, this is looking only through December of 2022. The next round of our evaluation will look at 23 and 24. We're waiting for 24 to end here. Then we'll have another 2 years to look. But anecdotally, we can tell you that the figures are still down in the P&I sites. But this is our interrupted time series analysis. Again, Denver was one of the cities in the U.S. that had a significant increase in violence during that period after 2020 and saw a 25% increase citywide in violence. But when you take a look at the 3 P&I sites, all of the sites either had decreases or lower increases in violence post-implementation period. Now, these are the districts. So districts 2, districts 4, and districts 5 had P&I sites specifically within those districts. And you can see in this case, District 4 really having such great impact here, a 17% reduction, while the rest of the city was experiencing a 25% increase in violence. And Tamara, again, you're working directly in these neighborhoods. Can you tell us a little bit about what was happening in District 4 and 5?
Absolutely. So I can tell you District 4 had a commander who, there's no better way to say it, he got it. He understood the importance of the entire network and not just focusing on those crime sites. And so I was really eager to see these results and see what would happen in District 4, and sort of at a gut level, knowing how well he understood the strategy, I had thought that he would have the best results, and here we see it. And it really speaks to doing this well and understanding the importance of places in the sense that they are networked to one another.
Right. And the other great thing about Denver, they really took on the issues with the board and putting together a robust P&I board to oversee. That all-city board is very active. They routinely meet, and they've been able to sustain this now since August of 2021, really when they started getting kicked off. They've been able to sustain that board and the work of that board all the way through. I think they just had a board meeting, 2 weeks ago?
Yep. Bi-weekly, They continue. Yes.
Yes. Great. So then looking across and also understanding those contiguous areas again, when we combine those PNI sites, 23% fewer violent crimes in the combined sites. Again, this is when violence was increasing across the city. We saw about a 19% fewer violent crimes in the contiguous areas. So here, there was clearly a diffusion of benefits, right? It's not just that we were making sure that crime wasn't moving around the corner, but around those corners was getting better. And then finally, when you put it together, 21% fewer violent crimes in the PNI sites and those contiguous areas. All of these are statistically significant differences. And then finally, we'll tell you about Tucson, what was happening in Tucson. Tucson is another one of our great success stories and actually outperformed all of the other sites in terms of their reductions, looking again at this pre-post implementation, and they've also been able to sustain these over time. What Tucson did that was really interesting and innovative is they changed their organizational structure within the police department. They actually created a specialized bureau that oversaw all the innovative type of work and put a commander that was in charge there, an assistant chief, to oversee this and other types of violence reduction strategies so that they could have those layered approaches and that it was much more comprehensive in nature and organizationally changing to accommodate that. Now we'll see what happens because that really brilliant assistant chief has recently taken a job as a chief up in Washington State. And so we're hopeful that Tucson's able to really just keep this moving forward. But here you see, again, Tucson was experiencing an increase in violence, and in the PNI sites, they were outperforming the city by a significant amount. 33% reduction in the East District compared to the Midtown District at 13% reduction, and finally a 19% reduction in the South Division. Again, all compared to what was happening citywide with those increases. So Tucson, again, a great success story for us, which pulls us right back to our concluding slide here. And I'm going to let my colleague just round us up with why we believe holistic governance is the approach moving forward.
And I wish I had come up with this term, Dr. Engel. I think I'd be somebody. It's actually a term used by a researcher in the UK, this concept of holistic governance. And I love it because it really is about bringing all the partners to the table. And what it allows you to do is not necessarily garner more resources. And this has been a huge issue in the United States. We are struggling with resources and obtaining the resources needed to effectively address our crime problems. But what it does allow us to do is be very focused and to maximize the impact of the resources that are there. And it allows us to have a robust, formalized strategy for taking police intelligence and then translating that into action and in the type of action that is likely to impact crime for the long term. I love the accountability piece in terms of the partnerships and having the city involved and knowing that this is not just a police problem. Crime is not just a policing issue. It is a community issue. It is a jurisdiction level issue. And so building those partnerships, one of the coolest things that Dr. Engel and I have seen, especially in the Denver board more recently, is other city departments going, wait a minute, you do that? I had no idea. And so the city personnel learning about themselves, learning about the resources that are available, and then figuring out how to partner in a way to, again, really maximize those resources. And importantly, having the community at the table, both in terms of helping to gather intelligence that might be missed if we were just looking at police statistics or just making observations externally, having that the community at the table to help inform those investigations, but then also long-term ensuring that their voice is heard in terms of what are the changes that we want to see in our community. When we envision our future, what might that look like? And so this is very different from traditional revitalization efforts that do a great job at reducing crime, but also displace the very people that were there to begin with. And so it holds a lot of promise for this more organic redevelopment approach to some of these persistent violent hotspots. And again, it's the sustainability that we're looking for. We don't want to play the whack-a-mole game, right? Where we're just, stomping down hotspots constantly over and over and over again and expecting a different outcome. We're really trying to do things in a way that helps us to sustain those reductions that we achieve over time. And finally, for us in the United States, especially post George Floyd, there's been a lot of talk around police legitimacy. What should be the role of the police? And in this type of model, police really act as ambassadors for their community, bringing city level resources into these persistent violent hotspots. And both of us can attest to this, Dr. Engel and I, we've never found a persistent violent hotspot that wasn't in an underserved community that was desperately in need of city level resources. And so the police sort of acting as that in that ambassador role to understand the dynamics of what's going on in the community and then advocating for that community has gone a long way in terms of changing the perception of police and relationships between the police and the communities they serve. So Robin, I'm going to kick this back to you.
Yes, well, we are excited to let folks know that we have just been awarded a grant from the Department of Justice, from the COPS office, Community Oriented Policing Services office, to be able to continue our work by providing and developing tools and resources, toolkits for law enforcement, and also for the boards, right, and other components to be able to implement with fidelity. That's really the key thing that we've learned as well. Implementation science we know is so critically important, and implementing with fidelity. And so we're going to be able to at least provide some of those resources. They will be then publicly available. And so give us another year or so to get all of that material together and push it out to you. I hope that you folks will be able to use it as well. It's been really wonderful talking to you today. And I think, Stevie, we're going to be able to turn it over for questions.
We are. Thank you so much. That was incredible. I was actually thinking to myself, we're going to have ages for questions. But then I realized it was just going so quickly because it was so interesting. Thank you so much. Right. We have time for questions. So either you can put up your hand and feel free to ask it and I'll try to navigate that. But equally, you can post in the chat. So we've got our first one. I think Jonathan has put up his hand.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much indeed. That was interesting. Now, I have to tell you that in the late 1990s, the first Blair administration, we decided that violence and other sorts of crime were more important than just for the police. And the Crime and Disorder Act 1998 mandated the formation of 373 community safety partnerships, which have done exactly as you've said, in effect, by bringing together police, health, probation, local government. And as a result of that, violence which results in serious injury and emergency hospital treatment has reduced across England and Wales by 65% since 2001, and continues on that downward trajectory, which is very different from what's happened in the United States, of course. So we've been at this for 25 years, and it's rather good to hear this repeat in the United States, and still at obviously an early stage. The Home Office published their impact assessment in 2019, which was signed by the Home Secretary, and the estimate for the cost savings was if just 5% of local authorities implemented this kind of approach, then the cost savings would be just £1 billion over 10 years. So that's if just 5% of communities did it. But this is universal across the UK. So and there's a particular emphasis here on the identification of violent places through emergency department data. And you may know this, but in general, in the UK, less than half of violence which results in emergency treatment is known to the police. And in a recent study in the state of Georgia, 89% of violence which resulted in ED treatment was not ascertained by the police. So there's great benefit, not so much in consulting the community, but in interrogating specific emergency department data. And the violence prevention data set, which is known as the Cardiff Model for Violence Prevention, has been incorporated into the software used in every emergency department in England and Wales. And that includes a free text field for the recording of specific violence locations. So that includes much closer, much more detailed than the kind of data you're talking about, which is street segment data. So there are named taverns, parks, schools, street locations, etc., which are routinely recorded, and that's one of the secrets to the dramatic and steady and sustained reduction over the last 25 years in serious violence. It's great that you've got some funding from Arnold Ventures, who is an organisation I know pretty well. And I've got two questions for you, really. The first one is, have you published a controlled study of this approach where cities are compared? Because we all know that violence is very it changes in its volume, doesn't it? And you have to have a controlled trial with the counterfactuals to show that you've actually achieved an effect. And the other question is, what about a cost-benefit study? You say that bringing everyone together constitutes a focused approach, but it seems to me this rather the opposite. If you bring everybody together, every agency, that costs a lot of money. So, and especially if it's going to be sustainable. So I wonder if there's been a cost-benefit analysis, an economic published controlled study of the costs and benefits. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, I'll take that one and then turn it over to Tamara for response. So just I may have mischaracterized the violence and the reduction in crime in the U.S. Yes, we saw an increase in 2020 and in the 2 years following, but we also have experienced significant reductions in crime since the 1980s. And in fact, right now, when you look across the U.S. in violence, we are at 50-year lows. So there has been a sustained, just like in the UK, a sustained concerted effort to focus on reductions in crime and violence, and we have experienced great success in that sense. However, having said that, we know that we have these micro locations and pockets of very extreme violence. In particular, our issue, as we mentioned before, is gun violence, which is a little bit different than what you're dealing with in the UK, and that's where our focus is. So thinking about cost, I'll take that one first, and then I'll talk about the randomized control trial designs. So when you think about cost, our government resources, they have a fixed budget, right? They're arguing for money every year, and that shakes out the way that it does. They have those resources in place. What we're asking them to do is to prioritize the resources they are already using. So a lot of times for these other governmental agencies, there may not be a real list of prioritization that's focused specifically on the larger needs of the community related to violence reduction. And so we're asking those organizations to come to the table and prioritize the resources they already have. They do not get an influx of additional dollars, but rather they're just prioritizing that. So in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, has one been conducted yet? No, there has not been one that has been conducted. Would we like to do that work? Absolutely. This is a strategy that, again, is layered on top of multiple strategies already. And so being able to set aside what the individual impact of PNI is in cities that are also doing lots of other work, including community violence intervention work that does not involve the police or government resources, is going to be particularly tricky for researchers, but we do have some folks that are working on exactly that. You also asked about the randomized control trial designs, and as we know, these types of strategies really do not lend themselves to a randomized control trial approach. We do have quasi-experimental designs that we're using and with synthetic controls, but we don't have a randomized control trial design, not yet anyway. Really, this was our first toe in the water, was to make sure that we had a strategy that was effective and working and lasting over time. Now that we've built that base, we're ready to kind of expand beyond that, and that's what we're hoping to do. Tamara, you want to take on either of those questions?
Yeah, no, excellent, excellent points in terms of what's been going on in the UK for quite some time, and many of my colleagues in the area of crime science. I mean, we work together all the time, and we're always sharing ideas back and forth about place, and these more recent conceptualizations of place beyond the crime site really comes from a lot of that thinking, a lot of that work about these individual places. And if we mischaracterize that we're simply focusing on street segments, that is not the case. A crime place network is made up of very specific addresses, and just as you were utilizing emergency room interviews, if you will, to identify some of those very important places that are part of that crime place network, we do the same in the United States. We do that as well. I think what the P&I strategy does is allows the community who also sees that on a day-to-day basis, those observations to be captured in unique ways. So we're not just waiting for a violent incident to occur, but we're able to identify before it reaches the emergency room what some of those places look like, or places that may, again, where the violence isn't necessarily happening, but is associated with the logistics of crime. We're bringing that into the conversation and into the intelligence that we then bring to the board to try to disrupt it. So minor differences, perhaps, but I think important ones, because for a long time, I had a very difficult time explaining as an academic why sometimes I would see displacement and sometimes I would find a diffusion of benefits. And as we know, diffusion of benefits is more likely than displacement when we have these types of approaches. And my working hypothesis, and obviously a researcher always says, we just need more research, and we do, we need more research. But my working hypothesis is that by focusing on that entire network, not just the high crime locations, the high crime addresses, but all of the other addresses that are involved in the logistics of that criminal activity, we're much more likely to, one, have a diffusion of benefits rather than displacement, and two, be able to sustain those reductions in those pockets of crime that Dr. Engel was just talking about, sustain those reductions long term, where we haven't been able to do that before, beyond just general reductions in violent crime overall. We still have places that are disproportionately affected by violent crime. And so this offers us a mechanism to address that. But thank you very much.
Yeah, if I can just come back very briefly, if I may. Yeah, I mean, if Anthony Bragger and Lawrence Sherman can do randomized controlled trials of hotspot policing, then you should be able to do a randomized controlled trial of this. And then the other point is David Weisberg, an eminent criminologist, and others have done work on the diffusion of benefits, and the halo effect of prevention on a hotspot targeted with policing, is well known. So that it's not a new thing that there's a diffusion, there's a halo effect of prevention. That's well understood.
Yes,
but thanks for coming back. Thank you.
And we're very aware of that research. It's critical research. It has informed all of our thinking. I think what Dr. Engel was talking about in terms of a randomized controlled trial, as you know, what David Weisberg and Anthony Braga do is they're looking at a very specific unit of analysis, right? For example, the street segment. And so they can randomly assign some street segments to receive that intervention and others not to receive such an intervention. These crime place networks are a bit more complex in the sense that they aren't simply the same unit of analysis. They're not the same size. They don't have the same dynamics. So finding an appropriate control, one that would really represent this is the exact same type of crime dynamic in a different location, would be very difficult to do. The closest we could get to that potentially is looking at, well, here's a persistent hotspot. Here's a persistent hotspot. We intervene here. We don't intervene there. But the crime place network in those locations are going to look very, very different. And from that perspective, it's really hard to say that that was an appropriate control location. I don't know, Robin, I don't know if you'd like to comment.
Well, and we have the same problem. That's why the majority of research around focused deterrence specifically is not randomized control trial designs, because we have the same type of issue with the practicality of having that type of intervention versus what we would like to see as pure scientists. So we're doing the best that we can at this point. We have some initial evidence to suggest that this approach is working, and we would love to have enough communities that were doing this type of work that we could figure out new and interesting ways to randomize. So thank you. I hope that you'll be a part of that.
Keep going. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, I'm going to hand over to Jack. Thank you for waiting patiently.
No, and thank you very much for the presentation. My question just around how you're involved in the implementation with the city management. I really reflected on the comment where you said from Houston, where they said they were spread quite thin, and I definitely recognise Jack Duncton from the Home Office and sort of leading on our sort of serious violence national hotspot policing programme. I very much reflect on the bit about having lots of initiatives going on, so it's difficult to maintain focus. But in terms of your model and maintaining fidelity about it and trying to balance implementation as strong as possible and naturally the impatience that happens, like this works, let's spread it and roll it out everywhere. What are your sort of reflections on how you can get alongside and work in partnership with those local areas whilst at the same time trying to be as sort of like as close fidelity to your implementation model as possible, and also your reflections on when cities decided to roll it out really quickly and how you would sort of counter against the risk that it would suddenly not work as effectively?
Well, that's a great question. I am going to turn it over to Tamara in just a moment, but I can tell you that as part of our research, we're also in the process of putting together our process evaluation as well. So looking and understanding in very clear detail the implementation issues and the problems that we had in particular cities, so that we can identify what those issues were and think through how we could build tools, resources, and different approaches to be able to avoid some of those problems. And Tamara, we were both on the ground. We sort of split our time in different cities, but I'm sure Tamara can tell you sort of her experiences directly on what was happening on the ground and why certain things were working and why they were problematic in others.
It's a great question, because one thing that I think departments crave, and we all do, is we want, well, give us the step-by-step guide. What do we have to do? And we'll just do it, and it'll be done, and we'll achieve success. And what we found is that although there are general principles and a general structure that benefits individual jurisdictions that are interested in this strategy, it looks different on the ground in every single jurisdiction for a couple different reasons. One, different jurisdictions have different governmental structures. So as you know, in the US, we are a mess, both in terms of the number of jurisdictions that we have, the number of police agencies that are out there. Those police agencies have different structures, as well as the city. Their government structures look different. So every P&I board, every P&I investigative team, in every community, they all looked different. So there was differences across every single one. What I can tell you in terms of takeaways, I think that Dr. Engel and I have seen in trying to stand up such a complex and partnership-driven approach to these very specific problems in these very specific locations, is that often what happens is, often happens, the police take the lead and they try to shoulder the whole thing. They shoulder the burden, and maybe if there's a jurisdiction that doesn't spend as much time on the board side of this, which is really the long-term sustainable intervention part of this, and without naming specific jurisdictions, some of them did better at putting together very well-functioning boards than others. And I think sometimes that we see that in the results as well, both in terms of the percent reduction that they're able to achieve, as well as the sustainability over time. So the two general takeaways is, one, it looks different in every jurisdiction, and that is a challenge when you're trying to say, hey, try this, and they say, what are other people doing? And we can't say just do A, B, and C. We really kind of need to build it from the ground up in your jurisdiction to make it context specific and make it work for your jurisdiction. And then again, second, making sure that everybody's at the table that needs to be at the table. And this doesn't fall back to what typically happens where we just have a policing-led initiative, that this is really about the integration of everybody and all of these resources. And it's really a collaborative effort.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time. We are now at our last minute. There's been another couple of questions that have been posted in the chat. I'm not sure we do have time for them. One that I did just want to ask, so it might have to be a bite-sized answer, but as you can see on the screen, there are the contact details, so please feel free to follow up. But do you think that the public, local residents, felt the reduction? Were they aware of it?
I'll take that one because we have, what's it called, Tamara? Pivot Point? The Pivot
Yes.
Point? It's an actual video that was put together by the community talking about what happened in Cincinnati and how they personally were involved and how they felt about it. Is it available YouTube, you think?
Yeah, if you just Google Pivot Point Cincinnati, you'll find the video. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I do think the residents felt it, experienced it, and they're clamoring for it. You know, once they have it in their neighborhood, then someone else hears about it. They want it in their neighborhood. So, I think they are feeling it.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Right, I'm going to have to bring the session to a close. I just want to extend a huge thank you to both Robin and Tamara for taking the time to share with us today. As you can see, there's lots of comments coming in and lots of applauses. No, I've never had applause. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. And, you know, I will be sharing the slides after today's events, but please do take the opportunity to reach out to them if you have more questions. But I think that's it for us today. I will be sending an email after this session with a link to the feedback form. So we really appreciate any feedback you have. So please do share it. Thank you for joining us today. And I hope that you join us at a future event and see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.